Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. Take Omnipod Dash out for a spin with a no-commitment free 30-day trial by the only ultra-rapid-acting inhaled insulin, and by Dexcom, keeping you in control with an integrated system for diabetes management.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, you know the mental health burden of diabetes is incredibly important, and you know it doesn't get enough attention. So what can we do as individuals, as caregivers, or people with diabetes to help ourselves? It's not always about seeing a therapist.
I work under a hypothesis that if there were 100 people with type 1 diabetes, there may be 3 or 4 of them who need to see me or someone like me. But there's also 96 people out there in that group who need something. And it's not necessarily seeing me as a therapist. Maybe it's scrolling Instagram in a healthy way. Maybe it's reading my book. Maybe it's listening to a podcast like mine or yours. But it's something, and there's lots of other ways that we can think about mental health other than actually seeing a therapist.
That's diabetes psychologist Dr. Mark Heyman. He lives with type 1, and he's on a mission to help more people understand how to manage the emotional challenge of living with diabetes. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I am always so glad to have you here and so grateful for a chance to get to do this every week. We aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and I just have to tell you, this is one of those kind of time-shifted shows, and what I mean by that, if you're new, I don't tape these episodes very far in advance. I come from a news background. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about that today. Worked in radio news for many years when everything was very immediate. So I try to tape this podcast as close to the air date as I can. That's usually about 4 days, sometimes a week. But with Benny's spring break and some traveling, I'm doing this show. I really put it together almost 2 weeks before you're hearing it. So hopefully everything holds up. I can't imagine that it won't for the type of episode that it is. But I like to let you know when I do things like this. Just, full disclosure type stuff. We did have a big celebration. It's just last night as I'm taping this of my old radio station. 100 years of WBT. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the show. It's not diabetes related, so I'm putting it at the end. But I want to just share a little bit about what that was like, a little bit about my time working there. And gosh, these big heritage stations, it's an AM station. I don't know how much longer these guys are going to be around. Not this particular station, but AM in general. But there is definitely podcasting, and I am grateful to be here and going strong. My guest this week is Dr. Mark Heyman. He is a diabetes psychologist, a person with type 1, and host of the Diabetes Psychologist podcast. I first spoke to Mark here on the show almost 2 years ago. It was during the summer of 2020, and I will link that episode up in the show notes. He gave us some great advice about managing diabetes and mental health during the height of the pandemic. Summer 2020, well before vaccines were available. If you want some calming strategies, I really highly recommend it. He also tells a story. He alludes to it briefly this time around about his diagnosis, which is now coming up on close to 23 years. But in this interview, you're going to hear, he doesn't tell the full story. So real quick, Mark was in college. He'd been studying French. He had an internship lined up for the summer at the U.S. Embassy in Paris, but he put off going to the doctor, even though he knew something was wrong because he was afraid they would tell him he couldn't go. Well, of course, finally, he had to see somebody. And 2 weeks before the trip, he got diagnosed. I believe the doctor called the paramedics to come to the office and take him to the hospital. His blood sugar was so high. But once he got diagnosed and they taught him what he needed, they said, sure, go right up to Paris. And off he went. Mark's book is coming out this month. It is called Diabetes Sucks, and You Can Handle It. We'll talk a lot more about that as well. And as this episode airs, it should be available. I will link it up. And we are doing a giveaway in the Facebook group and in the email newsletter this week for your chance to win a copy. I had so much fun catching up with Mark and learning more about why he wrote the book. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. And when you're deciding on a brand of insulin pump, there are a lot of things to think about, especially if you've never used a pump before. It can seem overwhelming. There are a lot of choices and you want to make the right decision. That's why I'm so excited to tell you about the Omnipod Dash free trial. Curious about trying an insulin pump or seeing what life without tubes is all about? You can now try Omnipod Dash free for 30 days. The trial comes with no commitment or obligation. Not right for you? No problem. Terms and conditions apply. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, also visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Mark, welcome back and congratulations on your book. That's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I really appreciate that.
You got it. The last time we talked, we kind of went in depth on the mental health, diabetes, and we'll talk a lot about that today. I wanted to ask you, though, why did you write this book? What was the impetus for it? What made you do it?
I've been trying to write a book for a long time, Stacey, and I've kind of had some fits and starts around what kind of book I wanted to write. And one day last year, it was probably actually about a year ago right now, I was with a patient and he said to me, "Diabetes sucks." And my response to him was, "But you can handle it." And all of a sudden it clicked to me that diabetes does suck and we really can't sugarcoat that. But really what we need to do for people's mental health is to show them that they have the ability to manage their blood sugars, but also their emotions around diabetes. And I really wanted to bring people a dose of reality, but also a big dose of hope.
You are a diabetes psychologist. I wish we could just kind of clone you, and put you in every endocrinology office because it's such a need. I'm curious, the person that said that, right, and the patients that you see, what brings them to you? Why do they come in?
There are three buckets of folks who I see. The first bucket are folks who are going through a transition. So they're either newly diagnosed or they've been diagnosed with a complication, or maybe they're just thinking about transitioning to an insulin pump or a CGM, and they're really having a hard time wrapping their head around what that means about them and what that means for them in their lives. Other people come in because they have a specific concern around their diabetes and their mental health. So, for example, they're just feeling really burnt out, or they have a fear of lows, or they're having trouble with eating and weight management and kind of all of that goes along with that. And then I have a third bucket of folks who come in because they're dealing with things in their life that don't really have much to do with diabetes, but those things, whether they're depression or anxiety, they have a big impact on their ability to manage diabetes well. And as we know, when you're not able to manage diabetes well and your blood sugars are on a roller coaster, it makes those mental health conditions even more challenging. And so we really focus on how can they manage diabetes well while also trying to manage their depression or anxiety as a way to get them healthier mentally, but also healthier physically in that process.
I wonder, do people kind of come to you and think, because I have thought this as the caregiver, right? I don't have diabetes, but sometimes I'm like, well, if we could just get this thing settled, right? If you could just take care of this one thing, everything else would fall into place. It's kind of like this magical thinking.
I wish I had that sort of power. I think, that's not the case at all. What I tell people is that diabetes never lives in a silo. And so we want to help people to deal with their challenges, but there's all kinds of different ways that our challenges come at us. Diabetes is certainly a big part of that, but then, family relationships and school and work and all of those things also play into the stress that we live in our lives. And when that stress becomes too much, that's where people have challenges. But the approach that I take with my patients and also in the book is that a lot of these challenges with diabetes and mental health, the frustration, the burnout, the anxiety, we can do things to proactively manage them, but we can never necessarily make them go away. My goal is really not necessarily to make those challenges go away for you. I wish I could, but I can't. But my goal really is to help you to learn to manage them and to handle them in a way that is effective for your mental health and your physical health and your emotional well-being in your life. And so if we can teach people how to navigate these challenges, to live well with the challenges, it actually makes them a whole lot easier to deal with and generally makes it easier to proactively take action to reduce them and make them not as prevalent in their life anymore.
One of the things, and you give a lot of examples throughout the book of real life T1D, you call it.
Yeah.
But it strikes me a lot of these have much in common with each other in that the person is so worried and is trying to control everything. Mm-hmm. And then they make a mistake that they can't avoid. Nothing horrible happens. And they're able to kind of move on. I don't want to encourage people to quote unquote mess up, although that is really, that's my personal philosophy is let's make all the mistakes and realize that we can get through them. Does it take that for some people just to kind of stumble into knowing I'm going to be okay?
Yeah, it really does. I see this a lot with a lot of my patients, but the biggest example that comes to mind are people who have a fear of low blood sugar. And they have a fear that if they go low, that something awful is going to happen. They're not going to be able to treat it. They're going to pass out. They're going to have a seizure. And while all of those things are definitely possible in the world, the reality is that the majority of time when people go low, they have the ability to deal with it. They have the ability to open their drawer and grab some candy. They have the ability to get up out of their chair and do what they need to treat it. And they have the ability to communicate with other people about how to deal with these things. Having them have that evidence that when these things happen, I have the ability to take care of myself. When I'm feeling burnt out, I still have the ability to manage my diabetes. I have the ability to go into my healthcare provider and be transparent and vulnerable, but also get my needs met. Getting the evidence that that's possible for them is extremely powerful.
Let me throw some stuff at you, just some scenarios and some ideas. And I'm curious to get your take on, mental health and diabetes.
Sure.
Let's talk for a couple of minutes. Let's talk about social media, because I am completely addicted. There's no way out for me. But I rarely feel good about diabetes because everybody seems to be posting the most amazing stuff. What do you tell your clients about social media?
For the most part, I tell them to stay off of it.
Yeah.
Because generally speaking, it makes them feel bad about themselves, either because they feel like they can never achieve what people on social media are doing, or they get wrapped up into these Facebook chats where people are not understanding what's going on for them and giving them really bad advice. That being said, though, I think there are some instances where social media can be extremely helpful. And that's when people feel really isolated in their diabetes and they feel like no one understands them. And to be able to see that other people are struggling, to be able to see that other people have high blood sugars, to be able to see that other people are experiencing burnout or anxiety and that they're not alone in those feelings is extremely helpful. And so social media it's a double-edged sword. It just depends on how you use it and really what platform. I find that, in my opinion, Instagram is a much better place to get support and to get normalization than Facebook is. But I think it really depends on what communities you're in and how you're using it. And also your mindset and how addicted you are to it and how wrapped up into those conversations and those posts you can get and how realistic you are about how realistic those things are.
The last time you and I talked was pretty much the height of the pandemic. Nobody was going anywhere. And as you and I are taping this is mid-March. People are going places. People are more hopeful. We're kind of watching. What are your clients talking to you about? I'm curious. A lot of people with diabetes are more cautious and are a little concerned about heading out there. What are your conversations like?
It really varies. I have some patients who are living life as normal, and I have some patients who are very, very anxious about life in this post-COVID world that we're living in. What has been most interesting to me, though, is actually not specifically life right now, but how the pandemic and the pandemic that we continue to live in has really amplified people's challenges, mental health challenges in general, but specifically with diabetes. I think that what I'm seeing is people who have anxiety about their blood sugars in general, you shine the spotlight of the pandemic onto that, and it exponentially, it makes it bigger exponentially. People who are generally calm and blasé about their diabetes or about their anxiety around diabetes, you're seeing them being much more free and flexible in their lives right now. I would say that with the majority of what I'm seeing, while a lot of it may look to be pandemic related, it's actually how the pandemic and the world around us has changed and how they're reacting to that and how that's really kind of highlighting some of the challenges that they're having with their diabetes in general. It's
a tough time right now. It's these in-between times, too, where everybody's kind of like make your own decision.
It is, and it's confusing. Yeah. I think that as people with diabetes, we want to be in control and we want answers. And right now, with diabetes, that's challenging in general to know what to do and what's going to happen with my blood sugars right now or tomorrow if I do X, Y, or Z. And I think we want the same thing with the pandemic. We want to know what is the right thing to do, what is the safe thing to do. And I don't think any of us really know. And so we have to we don't have to, but we do work to try to make these decisions on our own, certainly using the information that we're getting from whatever sources. But it's a challenging time because it's a lot of unknowns.
Right before we started recording, you and I were kind of talking about all of the FDA approvals that have already come this year. And it is wild to see technology moving forward. But I'm going to guess that while technology eases the burden in some way for people with diabetes, I've seen that in my own house with a hybrid closed loop, we use Tandem's Control IQ. It doesn't really seem to mentally change everything, at least not the way I had hoped and the way some of my relatives think. Do you use one of these systems? Can you speak to that as well? Right back to Mark, but first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Afrezza. And when it comes right down to it, there hasn't been a lot of innovation for insulin. I mean, sure, there are different brands, but nothing really unique when it comes to insulin delivery, except for Afrezza. Afrezza is unique because it is the only ultra-rapid-acting inhaled insulin available. It starts working quickly without the need for injections at mealtime. Once you breathe Afrezza into your lungs using the inhaler, insulin appears in your bloodstream in less than 1 minute, and it may start reducing blood sugar in about 12 minutes. Find out more and see if Afrezza is right for you. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Afrezza logo. Afrezza can cause serious side effects, including sudden lung problems and low potassium, and is not for patients with chronic lung disease such as asthma or COPD, or for patients allergic to insulin. Tell your doctor if you've ever smoked, have ever had kidney or liver problems, a history of lung cancer, or if you are pregnant or breastfeeding. Most common side effects are low blood sugar, cough, and sore throat. Severe low blood sugar can be fatal. Do not replace long-acting insulin with Afrezza. Afrezza is not for use to treat diabetic ketoacidosis. Please see full prescribing information, including boxed warning, medication guide, and instructions for use on afrezza.com/safety. Now back to Mark talking about how newer technology changes the mental load of diabetes, but doesn't really erase it.
I do. I use a Control IQ and I use a Dexcom, well, obviously a Dexcom with Control IQ. And for me, it has changed things in a positive way, but I wouldn't say a dramatic way. I feel like I can be a little bit more relaxed about my blood sugars, especially overnight. I generally wake up in range and it's amazing. What I've seen with my patients, though, is interesting. For many of them, it's been a game changer. It's been really helpful and it's taken a lot of burden off, especially folks who have lived with diabetes for a long time and have been through the different iterations of insulins and CGMs from the past and insulin pumps that weren't smart. For other folks, though, especially CGM technology is challenging because it feels like data overload. And especially folks who are naturally anxious and who are looking at their CGM all the time and seeing these variations in their blood sugar, it can be overwhelming and it can get addictive in a way that's not particularly healthy. Also, with hybrid closed loop systems, there's a level of trust that you have to have, both with your CGM, but also with the algorithm. And for some people, that's been a really tough barrier to get over. Really trusting the system and really trusting that it's going to take care of them in a way that's more effective than what they're able to do on their own. And so we do a lot of work with helping them to be able to let go of control, which for many of us is extremely challenging.
Just to remind everybody, you were diagnosed as a young man, but not as a child, right?
No, I was in college. I was 21 years old.
Yeah, but the first thing you did was leave the country.
I was in the country for 18 days before I left.
I love that story. You mentioned people who've lived with diabetes for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
These folks are so resilient, but at the same time, I worry about them being so resilient. They're tough. Do those folks talk to you? Do you find that generation is kind of more difficult to reach? I mean, they're just so tough.
Yeah, so I definitely see less folks from that generation in my work. They are a lot less likely to come to therapy. I'm not really sure why that is, but it is. What I have seen, though, with them around technology, though, is they really embrace it. People who have lived through the 60s and 70s and 80s without blood glucose meters at home, without insulin pumps, now that those things are available, they're all over them. The people who are diagnosed more recently are really the ones that I find are more resistant to those things. They are much more conscious of what it looks like on their body and how it may impact them socially. And that's partially because of age, of course, but I think partially because they don't know much different. They don't know how the challenges of managing diabetes, the very real challenges of managing diabetes with pig insulin and with NPH and with regular insulin, because they don't know anything except for Lantus or Tresiba or the analogs that we have right now. So there's an appreciation in the older generation, people who've been around a while. But there's also, for many of those folks, they were not, and to some degree are not still, even aware of that mental health challenges of diabetes have names. That that the diabetes burnout is a thing. They recognize what diabetes burnout is because they experience it, but they don't necessarily have a name for it because it wasn't talked about a lot when they were diagnosed, and it really hasn't been talked about a lot, really until probably over the past 10 years.
What do you think are some signs? And gosh, we can have a whole conversation about how hard it is to find not even a diabetes psychologist, but a healthcare provider who can speak to mental health at all. But what are some of the signs or things people with diabetes should look for that you would say, hey, it is time to talk to somebody other than your endo. It is time to try to find somebody who can help with your mental health. They don't have to have a complete breakdown, I guess is what I'm getting to.
No. Yeah. So I think that there are a couple things. The first is if the challenges that you're having, the anxiety, the burnout, the depression, are impacting your blood sugars and impacting your ability to manage your diabetes well. And that can be your blood sugars, you're feeling stressed and your blood sugars are out of range all the time and your endo kind of throws up their hands and say, I'm not really sure. That's a really good sign. Also, if you are having trouble performing the regular tasks of managing your diabetes, you're forgetting to check your blood sugar, you're choosing not to bolus for food, things like that. That's a great sign that seeing a mental health professional may be helpful. Also, if you're getting feedback from friends and family, they're noticing changes in you. That's a good sign. And then also if you're having trouble at work or school and your diabetes and mental health, your burnout, your frustration, anxiety is impacting your ability to do those things well, that's a big sign as well. But I want to say, Stacey, that the way that I think about diabetes and mental health, I want to think about it broadly. I work under a hypothesis that if there were 100 people with type 1 diabetes, there may be 3 or 4 of them who need to see me or someone like me. But there's also 96 people out there in that group who need something. And it's not necessarily seeing me as a therapist. Maybe it's scrolling Instagram in a healthy way. Maybe it's reading my book. Maybe it's listening to a podcast like mine or yours. But it's something, and there's lots of other ways that we can think about mental health other than actually seeing a therapist. Therapy definitely has its place, and there are some people who really need that, or it'd be really helpful for them. But we can find support and find mental health resources in lots of other ways. And that's really the goal of my book, is to be one of those resources.
That's a great point. Having things to read that you can relate to, having community to rally around. Mm-hmm. I think that has helped me so much. I can't imagine doing this without the moms that I've met over the years that have helped me. You mentioned something, I wanted to get a little bit more specific if I could. And I know you're not here to give, advice for any one individual. I guess we're a bit of outliers. I have never had an issue, especially, when Benny was very little and we dosed him. I was never worried about giving him larger doses. Like our endocrinologist just said, if he's eating something, you need to dose him appropriately. And it never occurred to me not to. But I was reading examples in your book in particular, and I've heard a lot of other folks talk about, I'm afraid to give too much. So they under bolus on purpose. The pump will say you need 8 units, they'll give 3. Mm-hmm. Or they need to give an injection. And the math adds up to, 10, and that seems really scary. So they only give 4. Can you talk a little bit about how to handle that?
Yeah. I think it really is experience in trusting yourself and trusting your ratios and being able to get evidence that you're going to be safe. There's a fear that if I take too much insulin, and too much insulin is arbitrary, what may be too much insulin for me may not be too much insulin for Benny or for somebody else. Yeah. And just in terms of our body size and our insulin sensitivity, things like that. But we want to get people to be able to have some evidence that if my pump is telling me I need 6 units and I take 6 units, that my blood sugar is going to stay in range, or it's going to, or maybe it's going to go high or go low. And that's really good information so that the next time we can make changes. Diabetes is really all about problem solving, and insulin dosing is a problem solving challenge, right? It's how do we dose correctly for the food that we're eating or to correct our high blood sugars. And we want to be able to give people evidence that, one, that they can trust their ratios and they can trust themselves in both their decision-making, but also in their ability to correct their mistakes if they make mistakes. And trust me, you will. We all do all the time, not on purpose. And they're I wouldn't even call them mistakes, but our bodies change and our insulin needs change on a regular basis. And so seeing that you're able to take insulin, you're able to managing the anxiety that you have around taking that insulin, and then being able to react appropriately, especially with technology and CGMs, to be able to respond to whatever challenges come up is really, really important in that process. But I think that we have thought about insulin in the wrong way, is that somehow that taking more insulin than necessary is, one, dangerous, and two, that there's something wrong with you or something bad about your diabetes management because you need more insulin.
Yeah.
And we really want to take away that myth and help people to see that how much insulin you need is how much insulin you need. Doesn't mean anything about you and your ability to manage your diabetes or your self-worth for that matter.
I think in some parenting groups, there's like something virtuous about using less insulin. It has nothing to, there's no morality to how much insulin you use.
Not at all.
Right? Unless you're eating, unless you're giving your 5-year-old milkshakes and for breakfast and milkshakes for dinner. And, if you're doing that, there's a different story altogether. But it has nothing to do with good or bad. It just is.
Yeah. And what we've learned with the hybrid closed-loop systems, especially with the pivotal trials, is how much insulin needs change on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I think we were under the impression that we needed, if your basal rate was set at 0.5 units an hour for half the day and 0.75 units an hour for the other half the day, that's exactly what you needed and that would never change. And we learned that is not true at all. We learned that these things change. I look at my pump and look at how often my basal rate's changing, and it astounds me how often and how much it is changing every single day. Probably 300 or 400 times every single day is how much, well, maybe not that many times, but it's changing quite a bit.
It can change. What is it? I'm
basis.
trying to remember the math. It is close to 300 times a day, right? Because it's every 5 minutes.
Yeah. My basal rates are set pretty well though. So maybe it's changing at half the time, but, and the changes that it's making are micro, but it's certainly not a flat number by any means. Yeah. But to answer your question, Stacey, the people who are, really concerned about taking too much insulin, that really comes back to a fear of lows. And I think that the fear of lows in people with type 1 diabetes is extremely underreported and something we don't talk about a lot or enough. There are lots of people who are very fearful of insulin and fearful that if they go low, that will be a catastrophic event for them. And so they'll do anything that they can to not go low, whether that's keeping their blood sugar high or not doing activities that they feel may send them low, like exercising or going places where they're going to be away from people. And for them, that really holds them back. And that's a big mental health challenge for them because it keeps them from doing the things in life that they really want to be doing. And if I were to sum up the mental health challenges of diabetes, we want people to be free and flexible as opposed to feeling trapped by diabetes. If we're able to help people to become more free and flexible in their lives with type 1 diabetes and not feel like diabetes holds them back, then the burnout, the anxiety, and any other mental health challenge that you have is going to be a whole lot less impactful on your life. And that's what we want to have happen.
Gosh. Yeah. And as you and I are talking, you're not coming across this way at all, but I fear I may be. I don't mean to be flippant at all as you listen. This is not easy. I don't want to make it sound like I think it is. Gosh, those challenges, Mark, when you talk about being free and flexible, it's so hard because, I was thinking when you said that being away from people, I remember when Benny used to ride his bike around the neighborhood. I was like, load up, right? Load up, take all this stuff with you. And thankfully, he doesn't have the fear, but I could see how people could certainly take that on. You want to be as prepared as possible, but you want to be flexible. Gosh, there's a lot.
Yeah. I was talking to someone recently who they were invited to go on a camping trip and they wouldn't go because they were worried about they were going to be in the wilderness away from society, from civilization, if you will. And they were worried about what would happen if I go low here? Who's going to be here to help me? And they had friends, certainly there were people around and they had glucagon. It wouldn't have been an issue, but they were worried, how will an ambulance get here? And those types of thoughts start going through your head and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the things I talked about in the book, Stacey, is we want to be honest with ourselves about the challenges of diabetes, but we also want to be honest with ourselves on the other side of sometimes we make diabetes more challenging than it needs to be. And if we're on either side, if we're making diabetes either less challenging than it actually is, or making ourselves believe that, or making ourselves believe that diabetes is more challenging than it actually is, we're not doing ourselves any favors. The only favor we can do ourselves is to be extremely truthful and honest about the real challenges of diabetes, because only then can we take action to address them. If we're working from a place of that's not actually truthful and honest, we're not doing this on purpose by any means, but we tend to do it in our minds, then there's not much we can do to address it.
I find it's this balance between respecting it, but not fearing it.
Exactly.
And I have a hard time sometimes on that line, even as the person without diabetes.
Yeah. And not dismissing it. Because if you say, well, yeah, I'm feeling awful today, I'm really feeling burnt out, but it's not that big a deal. Well, it actually is a big deal. It's impacting your ability to function in the world, and that's a big deal. But if you say, oh my gosh, I'm feeling burnt out, and so I have to stay in my room for the next week, I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but that's not being honest with yourself either. If you're feeling burnt out, yes, that's a challenge. But you have to ask yourself, does that really mean that I can't leave my room? Maybe the answer is yes, but most likely it's not. Most likely you can leave your room, go out, be active in the world, take steps to manage your diabetes. And generally speaking, the burnout passes. We know that burnout or any of these negative emotions don't generally stay the same, and they don't last for an extremely long time. And if you able to see the changes and the patterns of those feelings, it makes it a lot easier to deal with.
All right. I have a very silly issue, but I know, as you say, you can handle it. Growing up, the word sucks was a really bad word in my house. Like, we were not allowed to say it. And I'm showing my age here, but I was like, whoa, look at this book title. Have you gotten any pushback to it?
I haven't yet. I've actually gotten lots of people telling me they love the honesty and they love the realism. I'm sure that I will get some pushback, but that word was put there on purpose because I want it to be a little bit in your face. I want you to be a little bit shocked, and I want you to also recognize that diabetes does suck, and to be able to say that out loud, but also to say that you can handle it.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, we don't want to pretend that it's sunshine and rainbows. It is a great title. I'm kind of joking, but obviously it stands out. But it really, really growing up, oh my goodness, I would never say that word in my house. But it really boils it down because it's not a walk in the park, but then you know that you can do it. I like that it's not one of these situations where, right, it'll never stop you. We can do anything. Go climb Mount Everest.
Right.
That's not our story.
And also that's not honest.
Yeah. Well, it's honest for a couple of people who went up Mount Everest.
Well, not for most of us.
Well, let me know. I'm curious what the reaction is to the title, because I think most people are going to absolutely love it. And I think there's going to be one or two people like me who say, oh my.
Yeah, I have no doubt. My mother-in-law read the book and she's seen it. And if anybody would have a reaction, it would be her. And she didn't. Or she didn't tell me out loud. So I feel like I'm pretty safe there.
That's great. So just catching up with you, how are you? The last time we talked, you had one very young child. Yeah,
I'm doing great. My daughter is now 3. She has some attitude, but that's great. And she's doing great. She's it's really kind of fun to see her grow up and learn to interact in the world. It's also really cool to see her with my diabetes because, she doesn't really get it, but she will bring me Smarties and she'll say, Daddy, here's your low snacks. I don't think she really knows what that means, but it's really cute to see her be so caring about it. But yeah, I'm doing great. I'm really loving the work that I'm doing and really being able to dive full force into supporting folks with diabetes, both through my podcast and through the book and through all of the programs that I'm doing. And then, of course, my clinical practice, which I love doing. I love working one-on-one with people with diabetes. So I'm really having time in my life right now. I tell people that I wish I didn't have my job. I wish the diabetes went away and that the people didn't have challenge with it. But since that's not the reality of our world right now, the fact that I get to be on the front lines of supporting folks, I really couldn't ask for anything more than that.
I'm curious what you learned since you launched the podcast. You're getting close to 100 episodes now, so you've been doing it long enough, but you haven't been doing it for years and years and years. I'm curious, if you've learned anything, either about your own diabetes or about diabetes and mental health from the podcast.
That's a good question. I've learned I talk really fast and I need to slow down, but that's not really something that I've learned. I've known that for a long time.
Or from writing the book too.
One thing I've learned, especially writing the book, is I spent a lot of time writing the book, reflecting on my own journey with diabetes. It'll be 23 years for me this June. And really how far I've come personally. I feel very lucky that I haven't had a whole lot of really significant mental health challenges, certainly sometimes a burnout and some anxiety, but nothing significant. But looking back on myself over the past 23 years, for the first 10 years of my life with diabetes, I was very isolated and I didn't know anybody. And I remember, I talk about it in my book, one of the first people I ever really connected with diabetes was a woman I met at the gym who saw my insulin pump. And I met her, I talked to her, and just having the ability to connect with someone who gets it, who understands the day-to-day things I was going through, which I thought I was all alone in that process for a very long time. And then since then, in terms of moving my work into diabetes specifically, now I'm in a very different place. And so really reflecting on that time when I was in the dark ages, when I was not connected at all. And now looking at myself now, it's really night and day. I always tell people, don't wait as long as I did, because you really need to have that kind of connection, whether it's a best friend or whether it's just someone that you see at the gym or whether it's someone you DM on social media, whatever that is, it's so important.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining me, Mark. It's always great to talk to you. I really appreciate you spending a lot of your time and giving some free advice here today. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much, Stacey. I appreciate it too.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More information on how to get Mark's book at diabetes-connections.com at the episode homepage. And we are giving away 2 copies, as I said. That's going to happen in the Facebook group. It's Diabetes Connections, the group. There'll be information on how to enter to win in the email newsletter that goes out the same day that the episode goes live. So that would be on Tuesdays. You can sign up for both through the show notes. There's links in there. But as always, if you're not quite sure where to start, and sometimes these apps are terrible with the way they link things up in my show notes, you can go to diabetes-connections.com. I want to tell you a little bit about my old radio station's 100-year celebration. I'm going to share about that in just a second, but first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And if you're a veteran, the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitoring system is now available at Veterans Affairs pharmacies in the U.S. Qualified veterans with type 1 and with type 2 diabetes may be covered. Picking up your Dexcom supplies at the pharmacy may save you a lot of time, too. Connect with your doctor for more information. Dexcom even has a discussion guide you can bring with you. Get that guide and find out more about eligibility at dexcom.com/veterans. If you follow me on social media, you know I already posted about this in early April. My old radio station turned 100 earlier in April. April 10th, 1922, WBT signed on in Charlotte, North Carolina as the first radio station officially licensed by the U.S. Department of Commerce in the Southeast, and the third in the United States. It's a pretty historic place to have worked. When you are there, you are very well aware of the history in a way that, doesn't really happen at a lot of radio stations. Because they had kind of celebrations and reunions at milestone years, I believe there was something at the 50th. I know there was something at the 70th because I got there shortly after the 80th. There was a lot of memorabilia and talk about that. It was very, very cool. Of course, I was still there for the 90th and then got to go back. So real quickly, if you're not familiar, I worked in radio. It was my first job in college. I was a news reporter at the All News talk station in Syracuse, New York. Then I went into television news for a long time, but I went back into radio in 2002 at WBT and did mornings for 10 years there. Left, and that's pretty much shortly thereafter is when I started this podcast. Because of COVID and many other reasons, we're all kind of spread out. I haven't seen people in a long time. I certainly haven't seen these people. And my co-host Al, doesn't even live in Charlotte anymore. He lives up near Philadelphia, so he didn't come back for this. I haven't seen him in ages. I would love to see him. I'm bringing all this up just to say, I realized during that celebration how much I learned about radio I bring into this podcast. And I say this in the hopes that it's true, and you need to tell me if it's not. Because what I learned more than anything else at my time at WBT was about how we were a public service. And I know that sounds lofty, and I know most people in radio are screaming and yelling and not doing that anymore, but stay with me here. I really felt like it was a time where we served our listeners. And that's what I was taught to do. You were there to, in a small sense, right? News, weather, and traffic. We were there to, do you need an umbrella? Are you going to get stuck in traffic? This is before all the apps on your phone told you all those things. So you had to turn to radio, right? And that's what we were there to do. We were there to serve you, to be a public service, to entertain, to inform, to start your day off right. But to be there in a way that was, Al used to say, is a public utility. And that really rubbed off on me. So when I started Diabetes Connections, I can't say that I opened the microphone with that same lofty intention, but I do hope over the years that I have gotten close to that again, because I want to be that public service for you where we're getting that information. I'm disclosing when I'm doing sponsorships, when I'm taking money, when I have a bias about something. I think I do a good job at that, but I'd like to hear from you if I'm not, or if I could do more, or there's something else you'd like to hear. This podcast, I kind of started it selfishly for me because I wanted to hear these conversations, and boy, did I want to take part in them. You guys know I love to talk. But I continue them over the years because I do think that there's a need for something like this where we're not talking about the best way to bolus and how to manage perfectly and what the right thing in this absolute instance is to do and do it my way or it's not the right way at all. That's not what I'm all about. I did get a little sad at the celebration because it was a wonderful look back, but that's all it was. It was a look back. There was very little looking forward. I'm not sure what's going to happen to AM radio. I still think we need it. We need it because in emergency situations, we need it, right? When the power goes out and you can't charge your phone, you do need radio, but I'm not sure it's serving the public in the same way that I think it should be, and it might not be needed in the same way. So that's a debate for a totally different time. And I'm not the only one having it, but I thought you might find it interesting. As I said, I shared some photos and some other thoughts on my social media. I'm Stacey Sims pretty much everywhere that I shared those photos. Even on LinkedIn, I talked about it. I don't do a ton of LinkedIn, but I'm over there. Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. Diabetes Connections, of course, is the social media handle for the show itself. And you can pretty much ping me on any of those and I'll answer. All right, we are back on a regular schedule this week. Obviously, this episode airing on Tuesday. And then Wednesday, we'll be doing In the News live on social media. That's a video live. Is that what we call it? A video live? I don't know. Facebook Live, Instagram Live, all that stuff. Then on Friday, that turns into a podcast episode. Easy to consume that way, and we're off and running. Thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, thank you, and be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.